Good afternoon, everybody. While my screen says Martha Zierden, this is Chris Judge coming to you from the Charleston Museum, down doing some consultant work, and I'm here at the Charleston Museum, and Martha kindly allowed me to use her computer to host Lunch and Learn. We are very pleased today to have a friend of ours, Dr. David Cranford, join us. David's a friend, and he's been to the center. He's come to Lunch and Learns. He's been a Lunch and Learn lecturer in the past. Dave got his BA up at Appalachian State, did an MA out at the University of Oklahoma, and then a dissertation at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he worked in the Lancaster and York County area with the 18th century Catawba towns as part of UNC Chapel Hill's long-term research into the Catawbas over there. Today, David will be talking about Fish Weirs, a landscape project that he's been involved with, and I think this is going to be a really fascinating lecture. But before I do, let me just mention that coming up on June 18th, our next Lunch and Learn will be on the third Friday of June, as it always is. And we're fortunate we'll have Claudia Heinemann Priest, who is a linguist here in the Native American Studies Center. And the topic of her lecture will be Indigenous Languages of the Southeastern United States, past and present. And Claudia knows a good bit about this, so we're looking forward to seeing her on June 18th, and please join us. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to David Cranford. I should mention that I told him the lecture was on the 19th. He realized that that was a Wednesday and caught it. And then I sent him the link only about 20 minutes ago to join the Zoom. I had forgotten to do that. So David, thanks for being gracious about that. And apparently he's on vacations up in the mountains. So having a little lunch break with us. So David, I'm going to give you the floor.
All right, thank you. Let me make sure I'm sharing my screen. I hope everybody's able to see that. Thanks, Chris, and thank you for having me back. As Chris mentioned, I've both attended Lunch and Learn talks in the past, and also the last time I gave a talk, it was on my dissertation research related to the 18th century Catawba towns. Not too far from there. And as they say, it's now time for something completely different. The title of my talk is Where the Water is Shallow and the Current is Strong, Stone Fish Weirs in the Eastern Woodlands. And this is a reference to a passage in a 1705 account of weirs by Robert Beverley. And let me change my talk. Okay. There we go. I wanted to be able to see where I'm looking. So this was a reference, one of the earliest references we have are European references to fish weirs in the Eastern Woodlands. And it is kind of a perfect kind of starting point for where do you actually find these features. And what I'll say is that I'll also point out that this title slide is part of a commissioned painting by Chip Holton for a museum display from the Davidson County Historical Museum. And we're glad to have permission to use that. So let me get there we go. Today, I want to just give you a brief introduction to what I've been doing in terms of trying to look at fish weirs. I started the North Carolina Fish Weir Archaeological Program or Project since I've been at the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology in Raleigh, where I'm an assistant state archaeologist. After I talk briefly about kind of the origins of the project, I want to talk about the why, the what, the where, the when, and the who as it applies to fish weirs. And also I want to finish up by talking about where I see some of this research going and hopeful collaborations for the future. So the North Carolina Archaeological Fish Weir Archaeological Project came about in 2018 when I joined the Office of State Archaeology. though really its origins start in South Carolina, believe it or not. As Chris mentioned, my dissertation fieldwork was in South Carolina, looking at the Catawba towns in York and Lancaster counties. And the fish weir that I'm showing here is actually one not too far away from Catawba Old Town. And it got me thinking, even though my research didn't apply directly to these features, I did notice that they were there, and I started marking fish weirs as I came across them, and not a very systematic kind of way, but I would just give them little place markers and save them to my Google Earth program. And I just had a handful in my back pocket that I kind of knew about, and just made a little place marker for him. And it wasn't until I joined the Office of State Archaeology that I became a little bit more systematic with trying to find out where these features are in the landscape. Basically, the goals that I set out for this project was to create an inventory of where these fish weir locations were, not only within North Carolina, but in kind of the broader region. Though I certainly started in North Carolina, I've kind of moved beyond to look at the whole Eastern Woodlands. Another goal was to kind of look at and try to investigate the spatial distribution. Where are these located? Can we, just by looking at where they are, be able to say more about kind of how people use them in the past? I wanted to document individual weir locations, and potentially look at nearby archaeological sites to give a context for how these sites were used and maybe when they were used. And one of the ultimate goals of this project was to make sure that these sites are known, so that we can help preserve them and create public awareness about these features. So that's part of what we're doing here. So why should we study fish weirs? There's a lot of reasons. First and foremost, they're usually overlooked when it comes to archaeological features. They tend to be in the middle of rivers, which makes them a little bit difficult to access and study. And so by bringing attention to these kinds of archaeological features, I'm hoping that we'll have a better sense for kind of how they get used, or how they were used in the past, and what we can do to preserve them going forward. Another reason is that they, as submerged archaeological resources, at least in North Carolina, they're protected by state law. In any navigable river, archaeological features and artifacts are protected by state submerged resources law. And so that makes it part of the purview of our office, is to make sure that we have a record of where these are and help protect them. They can also provide information about how communities interacted with their environment, both during the historic period, but as well as in the pre-colonial period too. So one of the main types of fish that we know historically that were caught, and is pictured here, is the American shad, although in different parts of the Eastern Woodlands, different fish varieties were caught, like eel, red horse, suckers, variety of. And I'm also working with a colleague who is interested in the relationship of fish weirs and mussel shells, or mussels. And so having kind of a different take on not just looking at fish resources, but the potential for these as opportunistic places to look for shellfish as well. I also want to study fish weirs because there are new and developing technologies that can help us better document and research these. There are remote sensing techniques that I hope to apply to documenting fish weirs going forward, and I just think they're pretty cool. So not only are they interesting things to study, but they are important parts of a cultural landscape that are not only interesting from a historic period perspective, but can be important tools for teaching and learning for modern groups. The top picture is a photo of a group of Cherokee who are, it doesn't look like they're using a weir in this picture, but you can see it's a cultural practice using multiple people to help drive fish. And the bottom photo is a modern group of Catawba youth who are out at a traditional weir site learning about Cherokee practices. So these are really important places, not only for the archaeological perspective, but also for living people. So that's one thing that we can keep in mind. So what are fish weirs? They actually go by a lot of different names. They've been called fish weirs, fish traps, fish falls, fish dams, and really they're all talking about kind of a similar function, and they take many different forms. But usually what we talk about are fish weirs being the permanent structures that help channel or direct fish, and traps. The way I use fish traps is usually the movable or the movable elements of a fish trap, or of a fish weir. So, but we can understand fish weirs as basically any structure that is built into the water that funnels, blocks, or directs fish and makes them easier to catch. There are a lot of different types. I'll be focusing on the uppermost fish weir types, the flowing stream weirs, although it's important to kind of know that there are a variety of ways in which people have built fish weirs over millennia. There are these basically the three main types, the flowing weirs, flowing stream weirs, tidal weirs, and longshore weirs, all work in slightly different ways depending on what's moving. So in the flowing stream weirs, obviously you're looking at the waters flowing downhill. Usually needs to be swift moving streams above the fall line. Tidal weirs, based on their name, relies on the flow of the water from tidal changes. And then the longshore weir actually relies mainly on the movement of fish. And so they almost always have a long line either of sticks or rocks to break the flow of fish moving kind of laterally across the shore. And I want to give you just a few examples. So these are what I'm going to focus on talking about today. And these are the stone fish weirs that are pretty common. And you may or may not have seen these from a bridge, or if you've ever looked at Google Earth, you'll probably see some of these as well. Here's an example of a tidal weir that was actually discovered not too long ago by a citizen who was looking at Google Earth and saw this this shape in the water. And after consulting with local archaeologists in the UK, they realized that this was a tidal fish weir. And as the fish at high tide would swim kind of in between the rocks, at low tide they would be caught and funneled towards the point of that fish weir. Likewise, here's an example of some tidal weirs from Fiji. Again, this is a global independent inventions that you can find all over the world, some dating back thousands and thousands of years. Here's a really cool example of some tidal weirs from, let's see, that's from Taiwan. These are longshore weirs, an example of longshore weirs from Bahrain. You can see there the arrow shape. They would block fish and kind of force them to go into that little enclosure pen, which would make them easier to catch. Here's another example, another idea of the longshore weir from Micronesia. And then perhaps one of the most photographed fish weirs, this is the double heart fish weir from Taiwan, really famous example. Like I said, my interest has been on the stone fish weirs, primarily because they're relatively easy to spot from Google Earth imagery. But we know that there are stick weirs. They have been investigated by archaeologists in the past, and we actually know quite a bit about the stick weirs and stake weirs because of the wooden elements are easier to date, and when they get preserved, they provide a good source of archaeological information. Now, there's kind of a distinction that I'm making here between the stick weirs and the stone weirs, but in reality, it's very likely that even the stone weirs have some, or at points in the past had wooden elements. You can see here from an old postcard that shows a fish weir on the Swannanoa River with a historic fish trap, wooden fish trap set in the bottom of that V shape in the river. So it's very likely that many of the stone fish weirs that I've identified may have at one point and may yet still have organic elements that could provide radiocarbon dates or other cultural information. So archaeological research on fish weirs has not always been very robust. It's been very spotty, though substantial for some types, like the stake weirs, the wooden stake weirs, have seen a lot of interest in some places. One really interesting account by Rodney Peck, who documented some of the stone fish traps on the PD River in North Carolina, estimated that there were thousands of fish weirs throughout the Piedmont and along the Atlantic seaboard. And I want to point that out because my own research has shown that probably not thousands. I've identified about a little over 800. Not to say that there aren't more to find, but I think his estimation was probably a little high. John Conaway, the man pictured here, wrote the literal book on fish weirs, but his focus was mainly on the wooden stake weirs from Mississippi. So using his extensive research on weirs in general, I noticed that stone fish weirs were still not well understood, and certainly not well understood from a regional perspective. And so that's kind of where a lot of my research has started to build from. There are some very obvious obstacles to studying fish weirs. For one, they tend to be very difficult to date because as I mentioned, stone does not lend itself well to dating. Weirs are not typically impacted directly by compliance projects or cultural resource management projects, and so they're less likely to be included in systematic surveys. They tend to be hard to get access to and document or even see, especially when rivers are high. And so because they tend to have fewer artifacts, they're just not something that a lot of archaeologists tend to gravitate towards as a kind of less glamorous project to take on, but I think that they are interesting nonetheless. So the picture at the top of this slide is two people working a historic fish weir just below, or just you can see Town Creek Indian Mound right here, and the fish weir that's being photographed here was taken in 1934, right as Dr. Geoffrey Coe was beginning work to excavate Town Creek Indian Mound. And so it's located right here. We don't know for sure if this was used prehistorically, but there's a good potential that it was. And it just shows you the very complicated use lives that these fish weirs probably had. My main strategy for identifying fish weirs has been using Google Earth. And it's worth kind of talking about that as a method for identifying these. Google Earth really didn't exist before 2001, or its predecessor was first available in about 2001, and Google Earth itself wasn't officially launched until 4 years later. And one of the key tools that I use, this historical imagery feature, wasn't introduced until 2009. So being able to do this kind of research, even though we have aerial photographs available, to have them in one kind of particular platform really wasn't possible to do until relatively recently. So in terms of the historical imagery, Google Earth provides images that go back mostly to around 1993 is the earliest imagery that they usually have available. Though really the resolution and visibility really varies based on the location, the time of year, river level, and even the time of day. If the shadows that are being cast by nearby trees obscures the river, you may not be able to use that set of imagery. And it's really not until 2012 that we really start to see high enough resolution imagery that makes identification of weirs really possible. Now it's interesting, or I should note that there are some limitations, and there's probably bias in this survey strategy, mainly towards where I can actually see features from Google Earth. So larger streams are obviously easier to see, wide streams versus small streams. Now that may be a bias of the survey strategy, but it could actually show a cultural practice. Maybe smaller streams, there were other methods of fish capture that worked better and didn't require as much of kind of an investment of capital and energy to build these large structures. So that's one question that I will hopefully answer a little bit as I continue with this research. So here's just an example of one fish weir location. As you can see, that this is an image, not too bad, very grainy. This was taken in January of 1993. And obviously you cannot see a fish weir from this perspective. But as we go forward, by October 2005, the imagery that Google has is somewhat better. Now it's in color. Still very grainy, but it is very obvious that there is something in the river here. Here is October 2008. You can see that the imagery is getting better through time as satellite imagery gets better, new satellites all the time. And we can actually start making some really good observations about the structure of this particular fish weir. And And as you can see, not even though we are able to now have a much better, higher resolution image from 2018, we can't see the weir because river levels are up much too high in this image. So this is kind of an iterative process as I go through looking along river channels, going back and forth using different times and different sets of imagery to see if there are fish weirs at any given location. So not always the most recent imagery. There are also a number of different types of stone fish weirs that I've been able to identify. The most simple is the single wing, where there's just kind of a bar, stone alignment, a single stone alignment that kind of funnels fish to one side of the stream or the other. The most common by far is the simple V shape, where fish would be funneled in towards the bottom of the V, where there would be a fish trap, either a fish basket or some other means of capturing the fish once they're all congregated down there. Then there are variations on this V shape. This is a compound V where the wings kind of go perpendicular to the shore before they created a V. Here's a V with a chute at the end. This one's an interesting one where it has kind of a double chute at the bottom. And then some fish weirs have multiple V's or W shape. One of the most impressive is this one from Anson County, North Carolina, 31 AN 201. It's just a spectacular example of this multi V or W shaped weir. Google Earth is really helpful in identifying fish weirs, but I also use other sources of evidence, historic maps and navigational charts. Early Army Corps of Engineers maps from the 1800s sometimes identified river obstacles, and you can see this is an example of a historic map showing a fish trap. And when I can come across these, it gives me hope. In many cases, I can go to the Google imagery and look at the corresponding modern landscape and see if I can identify it, if I've already identified it, or if maybe it was subtle enough that I didn't identify it on the first pass. Travelers' accounts, archaeological reporting, and even citizen science. I've had public members of the public come out and contact me saying, hey, have you identified this weir yet? And I will look at my database and get their on the ground photos and try to help identify those and record those as sites as well. So where are stone fish weirs located? As I mentioned before, they tend to be located in swift flowing streams and rivers above the fall line. Below the fall line, rivers tend to slow down and become a lot more meandering, and the physics of this swiftwater fish weir strategy just won't work. Other types of fish weirs can be located below the fall line. Typically in estuaries, you could have some of the tidal weir types, but stake weirs and things like that just don't show up nearly as well on Google Earth. So that's, I've tended to focus on the stone weirs. So as I mentioned, most are found on larger order streams and rivers. And this could be a product of how I'm finding them using Google Earth, or this could be a legitimate cultural pattern, and more research is going to hopefully test that pattern. At least in North Carolina, the Yadkin PD River has the highest concentration of stone fish weirs. And if you look from a broader eastern kind of woodlands perspective, it has the highest concentration of any river in the eastern U.S. One thing that I will note is that if you can see, I have the blue in here are marking reservoirs, and I suspect that there are a significant number of fish weirs that are now obscured and just submerged beneath reservoirs where once they were active flowing streams. So there are a good number of fish weirs that I'm not able to identify using Google Earth, but there may be other ways to identify those as well. So as you can see, this is the distribution map showing the locations of fish weirs that I've identified, with North Carolina having just a little over 250 fish weirs, making it the highest concentration of fish weirs of any state that I looked at. But Georgia, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania had high numbers as well. Here's a little heat density map showing the concentrations. You'll notice that the large dot here at Georgia is it's along the Etowah River near the famous Etowah Mounds. Here is the Yadkin PD River, showing the highest concentration here in North Carolina. When were fish weirs made and used? And this is a question that has been difficult to answer for the stone fish weirs, but we can take some clues from the radiocarbon dated wooden stake weirs. As you can see, there have been several that have been dated successfully. Some date back 6,000 years, all the way up to the historic period. So that falls in line with what we believed many of the stone weirs were probably how they were used and when they were used. One of the reasons why it becomes difficult to date these is because we know that they were rebuilt and used by numerous groups over their entire use lives. And one of the ways that I've been trying to kind of use some proxy data is to look at nearby archaeological sites. And since I work for the Office of State Archaeology, I have access to the state site files, and I can do kind of a search around each fish weir location and identify what kinds of sites are nearby. While this is not an exact causal relationship, we don't think that every site that happens to be near a fish weir had anything to do with it, but it can give us a sense for the kind of the temporal information based on those sites can help us give us an idea of when they might be used. So here's a breakdown of the known archaeological sites around the fish weirs from North Carolina. As you can see, we see a large spike during the woodland period, and that we suspect that, or I suspect that a lot of fish weirs were probably originally built during the woodland period, but could have been some fish weirs could have been they could have been originally built during the Archaic period and worked and reworked throughout that period into the historic period as well. This is an interesting caveat. I had as part of my job with the Office of State Archaeology, I sometimes get emails and calls from citizens who find things and want more information about archaeological sites near them. And this was a ceramic pitcher, a very interesting artifact that was found in a fish weir, reportedly found in a fish weir near Town Creek Indian Mound. And it was actually one that I had not identified before this person reached out to me. And like I said, all fish weirs and artifacts as archaeological resources are protected by North Carolina state law. But this gives us some indication that if this artifact, this picture, which looks like it could, it's in the PD style related to the nearby town creek, it may give us a clue that this fish weir and perhaps others around it were being used at that time. So it's not a direct date, but it provides some evidence that that's when it was being used. We know that archaeological and ethnohistoric evidence tells us that weirs were both used by American Indians as well as later Europeans. And as I've already mentioned, they have really complicated use lives in which they were built, maintained, repaired, abandoned, reconstructed, and then later remodified. A really good example of this is the Hallman Weir near Webster, North Carolina. This is one of the best preserved V-shaped fish weirs in the western part of North Carolina, and it's currently owned by the third generation of the Hallman family. It was originally reported to have already been existing in the 1870s when the family first acquired the land, and during historic interviews about this fish weir site, they noted that it was completely destroyed in a flood in 1940, or around 1940, and was rebuilt by the family and continued to use until fish weirs were outlawed in the mid-1940s. And kind of the ethnographic information about this weir provides a lot of really interesting details about just how productive these features were for catching native fish. And they admitted that they caught truckloads of fish during fall migration. So that gives a little bit of information about seasonality, about when these might have been used, the kinds of fish that were successfully harvested using fish weirs. So really interesting story about this one. I've also had the opportunity to collaborate with other researchers and interested citizens, both in North Carolina and from other states, to identify and actually put boots on the ground and try to identify whether or not some of these fish weirs that I've identified using Google Earth are in fact good candidate, or actually fish weirs themselves. There are some that I identify as possible fish weirs that would definitely need to get in-person survey to determine whether or not they are or not. So I've been fortunate to work with some folks in Tennessee and Florida and Pennsylvania, identifying ones that they know about and kind of sharing that information. And I hope those collaborations continue, because I think they're very, very beneficial. One of the things that I've kind of done as part of this project is attempting a little bit of experimental archaeology and trying to make one of these fishing baskets or fish trap. My folks have about 12 acres of land in eastern Wake County with some natural stands of river cane. So I collected some and made my attempt at a fishing basket. That was a neat experiment to try to figure out what would it take to build one of these, and how was it. I not successfully caught any fish with it, but it was a learning process nonetheless. So that was a really cool experiment. Some of the future work that I think that we can do with fish weirs is I want to focus on kind of the preservation side. Documenting these is a good first step, but making sure that some of these places are protected in the long run and have kind of community awareness is an important part. And I think one way we can do that is through the listing some of these weirs on the National Register of Historic Places, either as individual properties or as multiple properties as a district, that's the one step that I haven't quite gotten to yet. But as I mentioned, also continuing with kind of regional collaboration with other scientists, other archaeologists, other citizens. I also think that there are opportunities to use remote sensing, both drone-based LiDAR mapping, as well as the potential of ground penetrating radar, which our office just recently acquired. So I'm hoping that I will one day be this guy in the little dinghy pulling ground penetrating radar over water. Usually water is not a medium that plays well with ground penetrating radar, but in fresh water, I understand that that's one potential way to get kind of additional information. So, and the ultimate goal is to do some targeted archaeological survey or excavation within a fish weir itself. That presents a whole host of logistical issues that I have not worked out yet, but I think that there is the potential to do some really interesting excavation work, identify whether or not there are organic or other artifactual remains associated with these types of features, these type of sites. So that's my overview, and I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has them.